On the morning of June 28, 1914, Sarajevo awoke to the sound of church bells and the clatter of carriages. The narrow cobblestone streets of the Bosnian capital were already alive with anticipation. For this was not just another Sunday, it was the day Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, would visit the city with his wife, Sophie. For the empire, the occasion was meant to display unity and order in a land restless under Habsburg rule. For the people, however, it was a day of tension, for Sarajevo was not just any city, it was a cauldron of nationalist passions, where Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, and Austrians lived together uneasily under the imperial crown. Beneath the ceremonial pomp, danger brewed in silence, carried by young men who saw this day not as a celebration, but as an opportunity to strike a blow against empire. Franz Ferdinand himself had mixed feelings about the journey. He was a man of stern bearing, tall and heavy-set, with a thick mustache and sharp eyes that often seemed to pierce those around him. He disliked pomp and distrusted the court in Vienna, where many considered him aloof and stubborn. Yet he was devoted to Sophie, the woman he had married against the wishes of imperial protocol, for she was of noble but not royal blood. Their marriage had been scorned by the aristocracy, but in Sarajevo, the couple would appear together in public with unusual prominence. Franz Ferdinand carried with him the weight of imperial succession, but also the weariness of a man who knew that his path was marked with obstacles. He had long warned that Austria's aggression toward Serbia was reckless, that war in the Balkans could unleash disaster. Ironically, it was his very presence in Sarajevo, a city already inflamed with Serbian nationalism, that would test those warnings in blood. The plot against him had been months in the making. In the cafes of Belgrade, whispers had grown louder among radical nationalists who dreamed of a greater Serbia, free from Habsburg rule. Among them was a shadowy organization known as the Black Hand, composed of army officers, conspirators, and idealists who believed assassination was a weapon of liberation. Gavrilo Princip was one of them, a frail, sickly young man of 19, with dark eyes and a thin frame weakened by tuberculosis. What he lacked in strength he made up for in resolve. To him and his fellow conspirators, Nedeljko Kabrinović, Trifko Grabez, and others, the Archduke was not just a man but a symbol. The embodiment of foreign domination over Slavic peoples. By killing him, they believed, they would send a message that would echo across the Balkans. They were armed with pistols and grenades, smuggled across the border with the help of sympathetic officers. Yet they were hardly seasoned killers, they were boys turned revolutionaries, driven by passion rather than experience. Each of them understood that the mission was likely suicidal. Few expected to escape alive. But in their youthful hearts, death itself was a small price for the cause of freedom. Sarajevo, they believed, was the place where their sacrifice could ignite a fire across the Balkans, a fire strong enough to weaken the empire and give birth to a new future. As the Archduke's motorcade prepared to depart, the conspirators positioned themselves along the Apple Quay, a riverside street that wound through Sarajevo. The day was hot, the air heavy with summer dust. Crowds gathered on balconies and sidewalks, waving flags, craning their necks to glimpse the royal couple. Police and military officers lined the route, though their vigilance was casual. After all, the Austro-Hungarian officials had dismissed warnings of a possible attack as exaggerated. Franz Ferdinand himself, in his brusque way, had refused to alter the schedule. To cancel would have been seen as weakness, and weakness was a luxury an empire could not afford. At around 10:10 a.m., the motorcade began. 6 automobiles rolled forward, carrying officials and guards, with the Archduke and Sophie in the third car, an open-top Graf and Stift limousine. The Archduke wore his uniform of a general, adorned with medals, while Sophie sat beside him in a white dress and wide-brimmed hat, smiling warmly at the crowds. Their presence seemed to reassure the onlookers. For a moment, Sarajevo looked less like a tinderbox and more like a proud city greeting its future rulers. But along the route, the conspirators waited, hearts pounding, hands clutching weapons beneath their coat. The first attempt came from Kabrinović, who hurled a grenade at the Archduke's car. Fate intervened. The device struck the folded cover of the car's rear, bounced backward, and exploded beneath the next vehicle. The blast wounded several officers and bystanders, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. In the chaos, Kabrinovich swallowed a cyanide capsule and leapt into the river. The poison failed to kill him, and the river, shallow in summer, was barely waist-deep. He was dragged out by police, beaten by an enraged crowd, and arrested. The attempt had failed, but the day was not yet over. The Archduke's car sped onward, shaken but determined to continue the program. Franz Ferdinand's face darkened with anger. "So this is how they greet us," he muttered bitterly. Yet he refused to abandon the visit. After attending a reception at the town hall, he insisted on going to the hospital to see the wounded from the grenade attack. This decision, born of duty and pride, set the stage for tragedy. For in the confusion, his drivers were not informed of a last-minute change in the route. As the convoy turned onto Franz Joseph Street, it inadvertently rolled past the very spot where Gavrilo Princip stood, dejected after the earlier failure, but still carrying his pistol. It was as though destiny itself had conspired. Princip, thin and pale, with sunken eyes, had been lingering near Moritz Schiller's café. He could scarcely believe his luck when the Archduke's car appeared directly in front of him, slowed by the mistaken turn. In a moment that seemed suspended in time, he stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Sophie in the abdomen. She collapsed beside her husband, whispering, "For God's sake, what has happened to you?" The other bullet pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck. Blood filled his uniform as he struggled to keep his composure, murmuring to his wife, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." But within minutes, both lay dying in the car, the crowd around them screaming, guards rushing helplessly. By 11 a.m., the Archduke and his beloved Sophie were dead. The news spread with lightning speed. In Vienna, shock gave way to rage. The Emperor's court saw not just an assassination but a direct challenge to Habsburg authority. In Belgrade, officials scrambled to deny involvement, though evidence pointed to Serbian military circles aiding the conspirators. Across Europe, the event was greeted with disbelief, then foreboding. It was not the first political assassination of the era, but this one struck at the very heart of Europe's fragile balance. An heir to an empire had been slain by a nationalist youth, and the old continent trembled at the implications. The murder in Sarajevo became more than a crime, it became a spark. Austria-Hungary, determined to crush Serbian defiance once and for all, prepared an ultimatum. Germany, bound by alliance, promised full support. Russia, protector of the Slavs, signaled that it would not abandon Serbia. France watched carefully, tied to Russia, while Britain, still cautious, feared the collapse of peace. What had begun as a pistol shot on a Balkan street would, within weeks, pull the great powers into a war unlike any the world had ever seen. The fuse had been lit, and the world stood on the edge of an abyss. The guns of August did not arrive by accident. They came as the inevitable consequence of promises made in secret rooms, of alliances sworn in marble palaces, and of rivalries sharpened by pride. In the weeks after Sarajevo, Europe became a chessboard on which each empire moved its pieces toward war. Diplomats spoke of peace, but their armies marched. Politicians issued proclamations, but their generals prepared timetables. The great powers, chained together by treaties meant to preserve balance, now found themselves dragged toward catastrophe by their own commitments. The age of empires had collided with the fury of nationalism, and the result was a war that no one could stop. Austria-Hungary moved first, issuing its ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914. It was not an invitation to negotiate but a deliberate provocation, a list of demands so harsh that no sovereign nation could accept them in full. Among them was the requirement that Austrian officials be allowed to participate in investigations within Serbia itself, a violation of sovereignty. Vienna knew Serbia would resist, and it counted on German support when the conflict spread. Indeed, the Kaiser and his generals had already given Austria a blank check, promising full backing even if the crisis drew in Russia. Serbia, under enormous pressure, accepted most of the demands but balked at those that compromised its independence. Austria declared war on July 28. The declaration lit the fuse. Russia, bound by its role as protector of the Slavic peoples, announced mobilization. Germany responded with an ultimatum to Russia to halt its preparations. When no answer came, Germany declared war on August 1. France, tied by treaty to Russia, ordered its own mobilization, and Germany swiftly declared war on France as well. To execute its long-prepared Schlieffen Plan, a strategy to quickly defeat France by striking through Belgium, Germany demanded passage through Belgian territory. When Belgium refused, Germany invaded on August 4. That same day, Britain, sworn to protect Belgian neutrality and unwilling to allow Germany to dominate the continent, declared war. In a matter of days, Europe had plunged into a conflict that spread like wildfire across colonies and oceans, pulling in nations as far as Canada, Australia, India, and Japan. The world had never seen mobilization on such a scale. Trains crisscrossed the continent, carrying millions of men from their villages and cities to the front. Soldiers, many young and untested, marched through cheering streets as civilians showered them with flowers. In Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and London, crowds sang patriotic songs, waving flags in a frenzy of excitement. They believed the war would be short, perhaps over by Christmas. Politicians promised glory, generals promised victory, and newspapers fed the fire with headlines proclaiming duty and honor. Yet beneath the jubilation, some foresaw the truth. This was no limited conflict but a war that would consume the old world. The Schlieffen Plan, conceived years earlier by German generals, envisioned a swift knockout blow against France before Russia could fully mobilize. To achieve this, Germany's armies swept through Belgium in massive force, intending to encircle Paris from the north. But Belgium, though small, resisted fiercely. Its army, though outnumbered, fought valiantly at Liege, delaying the German advance. More crucially, the invasion outraged Britain, whose public opinion now rallied fully behind war. The German army, with its disciplined troops and heavy artillery, crushed Belgian fortresses one by one, but every day lost upset the delicate timetable of the plan. War, it turned out, was not as neat as the generals had drawn on their maps. As the German juggernaut pressed westward, the French launched their own offensive under the banner of Plan 17, charging into Alsace and Lorraine with cries of Vive la France. Clad in bright red trousers and blue coats, the French soldiers looked almost like relics of another century. The result was a massacre. German machine guns and artillery cut them down in waves, and the French offensives collapsed with horrendous losses. Still, the French spirit did not break, and the nation steeled itself for a long fight. By September, German forces were within striking distance of Paris, and it seemed the Schlieffen Plan might succeed after all. But the Battle of the Marne changed everything. In a desperate counterattack, French and British forces halted the German advance along the Marne River. Paris itself prepared for defense. Taxis famously ferried soldiers to the front as if the city itself were arming. Over several days of brutal fighting, the Allies forced the Germans to retreat. The war of movement, the grand dreams of quick victory, collapsed into stalemate. Both sides dug in, carving trenches into the soil from Switzerland to the English Channel. The Western Front was born, a scar across Europe that would define the conflict for years to come. Life in the trenches was unlike anything soldiers had imagined. At first, the dugouts were shallow and hastily built, but as weeks turned into months, they grew into vast networks of mud and misery. Soldiers lived among rats, lice, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of filth, where men stood knee-deep in mud that swallowed boots and froze feet. Corpses lay half-buried in the earth, silent reminders of failed charges and shattered hopes. Machine guns dominated no man's land, that desolate stretch of barbed wire and shell craters where countless assaults ended in slaughter. Above it all, artillery thundered day and night, churning the soil into a wasteland. And yet, amidst the horror, a strange rhythm of life emerged. Soldiers learned to endure the constant shelling, to duck instinctively at the whistle of incoming fire. Letters from home became lifelines, cherished fragments of a world untouched by the madness. Humor, songs, and camaraderie bound men together in the face of despair. For many, the enemy was not some faceless demon but another poor soul suffering in the trench opposite, equally caked in mud, equally longing for home. But the machinery of war gave no room for pity. Generals demanded attacks, politicians demanded results, and the trenches filled with the blood of a generation. What had begun as a war of pride and calculation was becoming something darker, a war of exhaustion, where victory would be measured not by swift triumphs but by who could endure the longest. The old world of cavalry charges and bright uniforms was dead. In its place rose the age of mechanized slaughter, an age defined by steel, fire, and the endless mud of the trenches. The world had entered a conflict from which there would be no easy escape. The year 1918 opened with both sides weary, bleeding, and desperate. After nearly 4 years of slaughter, Europe was a graveyard of hopes. The trenches still scarred the land from the Swiss border to the North Sea, but the old certainties of war had vanished. Millions lay dead, millions more wounded or maimed, and entire nations staggered under hunger, debt, and despair. The great powers were still locked in combat, but time was running out for the Central Powers. Their enemies, though exhausted, were reinforced by new energy from across the Atlantic. The entrance of the United States in 1917 had tilted the balance, and in the final year of the war, it would prove decisive. Germany knew its moment was slipping away. Starved by the British blockade, racked by food shortages, and shaken by political unrest, the Reich gambled on one last massive offensive to win the war before American strength could be fully brought to bear. In the spring of 1918, General Erich Ludendorff launched the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle, throwing hundreds of thousands of men against the Allied lines in France. The assault was ferocious. German stormtroopers, specially trained to infiltrate enemy positions, struck with unprecedented speed, bypassing strongpoints and spreading chaos. For a moment, the dream of victory seemed real. The German army advanced farther than it had since 1914, threatening Paris once more. But the gains came at a terrible price. Supplies could not keep up, and the exhausted troops lacked reserves. The Allies, under the newly appointed Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch, absorbed the blows and held firm. By summer, fresh American divisions poured into the front, young and eager, bringing numbers and morale the Allies desperately needed. At the Second Battle of the Marne in July, the tide turned. The German advance was halted, then thrown back. In August, the Allies struck back with the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of assaults that shattered German defenses. Tanks rolled forward in mass for the first time, supported by aircraft and coordinated artillery. The battlefield that had been static for years suddenly erupted into movement, but this time it was Germany in retreat. Meanwhile, the Central Powers unraveled. Austria-Hungary, riven by nationalist revolts among its many peoples, could no longer sustain the fight. Its armies disintegrated, and the empire began to dissolve into separate nations. Bulgaria surrendered in September, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October after defeat in the Middle East. Germany stood alone, its allies gone, its armies collapsing, its people rising in revolt. In November, strikes and mutinies swept through German cities. Sailors at Kiel refused to sail on a final, suicidal mission, and their defiance spread to workers and soldiers across the country. Revolution was in the air. The Kaiser, once so confident in his divine right to rule, now faced the collapse of his throne. On November 9, Wilhelm II fled into exile in the Netherlands. 2 days later, the war ended. On the morning of November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, German delegates signed the armistice. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. Soldiers who had lived in thunderous bombardment for years stood in stunned silence as the war simply stopped. Across Europe, bells rang, crowds cheered, and weary men wept. The Great War, which had begun with such confidence in 1914, had ended in exhaustion, bitterness, and ruin. But peace did not mean harmony. The world that emerged from the war was shattered. Europe was littered with ruins and cemeteries. Entire towns had vanished under bombardment, landscapes were scarred by shell holes and trenches, and generations of young men were gone. Economies were ruined, empires had collapsed, and political systems tottered. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian empires, all pillars of the old order, were gone. In their place arose fragile new nations, uncertain democracies, and revolutionary movements. The old balance of power was dead, and something new, something unstable, was struggling to be born.